Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to draw a dog nose in pastels and also how to draw the muzzle of an older dog. So where the white or grey hairs are around the mouth and the nose, this is one of the more challenging areas to get right. Now in terms of the nose aspect, I want to be making sure that I've got the proportions right. So first of all, I start by mapping in the nostril position, the size of those nostrils, and then the lower shape of that nose. Now in some reference photos you'll see that that dog has the darker line down the centre of the nose. I also like to put that in as well. Now once I've got all of those three things right and I'm very confident with the proportions so far, that's when I can start working on my base layer. Now here you can see I'm just creating a little swatch. Now this tutorial is available on my Patreon channel all in real time, and what I'm doing there is explaining the pencils that I'm using and why. Now this is one of the most common questions that I'm asked, so I try to cover it as often as I can in my real-time tutorials on Patreon. Now for the base layer stage I'm using my pastel pencils, but of course you could use your soft pastel sticks or your pan pastels. Now the reason why the pastel pencils are my preference, especially for the noses of any animal, is I can be very accurate with where I'm putting my lights and my darks. Now as I'm building up the contrast here, reinforcing the darker shadows on the nose and now some of my mid-tone highlights, this nose is already starting to take on a three-dimensional shape. Now the placement and position of your highlights and shadows is very important. If you have them slightly wrong, you're going to make the nose look a bit of an odd angle or an odd shape. So you do want to be making sure that where the highlight on the top of the nose, where it curves over to the flat surface, where the bridge of the nose starts, you want to make sure that main highlight is in the right place. If you have it too high, you're going to make the front surface of the nose where the nostrils are look too tall. Now if you've seen many of my other tutorials here on YouTube, you'll know that I put a lot of emphasis on getting the base layer right. Now the reason for that is I can now get to this stage and start building up the initial texture of the nose. So the one thing here that's very important is you don't want to jump to your brightest highlight early on. You still want to be building up all of those layers gradually. Now by doing this here, you can see that again this nose is now starting to take on an even more three-dimensional shape. I'm hinting at the way that the nostrils curve over the front surface of the nose. I'm reinforcing those lighter dots for the top of the highlight. Now regardless of the size of the nose that I'm drawing, the processes here that I'm demonstrating would be the same even with a portrait that was smaller, but the only thing that I would have to bear in mind is that when working on a smaller scale you're not able to add in as much detail just because you don't have the room. But you can still hint at the main highlights, get the position of those right, same with the shadows, and focus on the contrast. Now this nose did have a couple of those pink pigment patches and I want to make sure that I get those in because that's what makes that dog unique. So I want to be focusing on any tiny little details like that, especially if we're taking on pet portrait commissions, because those little things there are what make that person's pet unique to them. Okay, so the main focus for me wanting to create this tutorial is I had a request from a Patreon member asking if I could demonstrate how to draw the white grey hairs on the muzzle of an older dog. So this is really the main aim and why I created this project. So onto that aspect of this little drawing, and the first thing I want to work on is my base layer. Now to show my Patreon members a range of techniques, I have used pan pastels here for that very initial stage. But as you can see, it looks quite messy. So what I'm going to start to do now is come in with my pastel pencils and tidy everything up. Now the first layer with the pan pastels was exactly the same aim as when I used the pastel pencils for the nose. So the pan pastels, it's purely just mapping in the lights and the darks, but it does look quite messy. Now the one thing that you can see from this pan pastel layer is that the white transfer lines are still showing through. Now that's very important. If you add 2 or 3 more layers of pan pastel to cover those up, or to potentially make your darker areas even darker or your highlights brighter, you're going to end up filling the tooth of the paper. Now this is one of the most common things that can happen when working with pan pastels, and you want to save those layers where you're refining your lights and your darks and the colour for your pastel pencils. The pan pastel pigment is significantly softer than your pastel pencils, so filling the tooth of the paper with pan pastels will happen very, very easily if you carry on using those for building up that base layer. So as you've seen there, I basically just did one very thin layer and that was it. Now in with my pastel pencils, and I'm just going to start to build up the texture. Now what I'm doing here is just trying to break up this one lighter section where I'm going to have more of those white grey hairs. Now it's at this stage where I start focusing on pencil technique. So I've got a video here on YouTube. It's my top tips for drawing realistic fur in pastels. I'll link that in the description below if it's of interest. But there, what I'm talking about are the fur direction, the fur length and the fur thickness. Now when we're drawing shorter coated dogs like this here, the three things that I've just mentioned are all coming into consideration at the same time, because the amount of time that your pencil's in contact with the paper is significantly less than drawing a longer coated animal. So here we need to be making sure that the pencil strokes are curved, we don't want any straight lines, and that then we're focusing on the way that that pencil should be navigated and moved to follow that fur direction, that we're applying the correct amount of pressure for getting the thickness of that pencil stroke right, and then also the length of those pencil strokes, so how long that pencil's in contact with the paper for. Now here obviously the fur is pretty much a similar length over this area of the grey hair section, but as we come to working on the whiskers, everything is significantly longer. Now at this stage it would be very tempting to add the whiskers or longer hairs in now, but we want to save those for that last layer. Now all I'm going to be doing here is again just building up my layers gradually. Now this is something that I talk about in every single tutorial, both on YouTube and on Patreon. Building up layers gradually is one of the best ways of achieving maximum depth in the portraits that we're creating. Now the wonderful thing about pastels, and I'm demonstrating it here on this section, is that they're very versatile. You can work from light to dark, you can work from dark to light, or you can mix the two combinations together. Now as long as you're building up with lighter layers and not going in with heavy layers of pastel, then we're able to continue layering like this as much as we want if we're working on pastel matte paper. Now pastel matte is one of the best surfaces that I've ever tried for pastels, and it is what I work with for 99% of projects. I do have a little kitten tutorial here on YouTube where I'm just using a different sort of paper, and I'll link that in the description below as well. And that paper was great. I think that's going to be a really nice introduction to pastel paper if you don't want to invest in pastel matte first. But for detailed work and building up your layers like this, the pastel matte paper is wonderful to work on. Now when it comes to building up the fur around the muzzle, I want to be paying very close attention to the pencil technique, those three things: fur direction, fur length and fur thickness. So here we've got to try to imagine that the nose is closer to the viewer, closer to the person taking the photograph, and then this fur that we're starting to work on now is going away from the viewer and towards the eyes. Now in terms of this, again, look at how I'm building up the layers gradually. I've also lengthened my pencil strokes for the fur underneath the muzzle where the neck fur would be. So this dog was a collie type dog, so the fur on the face is meant to be significantly shorter than anywhere else. So that's something that if you were drawing the entire dog, that you want to pay very, very close attention to. Now I enjoy making these smaller focus studies because you can really refine and perfect the techniques without having to work on a complete project. And I've got lots of tutorials like this planned for my Patreon channel, but if you've got any specific requests of subjects you would like to see for these little studies, then pop them in the comments below because I'm more than happy to add any specific requests to my list. And if you are interested in watching the real-time version or any of my in-depth tutorials on Patreon, then I will link that in the description below. So at this stage here, all I'm doing is really refining my contrast. I'm darkening up any of my shadows and then go back in and add any of my lighter details and just really refining anything that stands out. So these little changes here make a big difference, and what I would recommend to do is put the artwork away for a day or two when you think it's finished, then look at it with fresh eyes, and if you don't notice anything that needs changing, that's when I personally call it done. But if you were then to get that out and you think, do you know, I could just make a little change here or there, then go ahead and make those alterations because you'll find that it adds so much extra depth and realism to the finished piece. So I really hope that this video has been useful. If it was, I would really appreciate it if you could give it a like and a thumbs up because it makes a huge difference to my channel. I also upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you'd like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you've got any art related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments below because I'm more than happy to help if I can. I'm going to upload another video to YouTube next week, but as always, thank you so much for watching.